still live here in Chesnadilla, Romania. We're getting into Daniel chapter 8, and we'll get right into it. I'm going to try to do this as speedily as I can, but I don't want to cut it short either. We're going to try to take the time that needed. There's a lot in this chapter, and so I think probably next to Daniel chapter 11, maybe more here than any others besides that, as far as the prophecy and things like that goes. We'll look at some the prophecies here. As I said before, I like a lot of the practical applications, and so we're not going to leave the practical applications entirely out, but we are going to see more, and we've already seen a lot about the sovereignty of God, and we're going to see more prophecies here, and we've dealt some with those, but we're really getting into some things. And so like I say, some of this is history, some of it's prophetic. It was all prophetic at the time Daniel wrote the book. So it says in verse 1, in the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, after that which appeared to me at the first. And I saw in which that would have been chapter 7, and I saw in the vision, and when I saw, I was in Susa the citadel, which is in the province of Elam, and I saw in the vision, and I was at the Uli Canal. Now, in the 3rd year of the reign of Belshazzar, we're told here, so that would indicate that the handwriting that came on the wall was Belshazzar's last year. And so we see that Daniel had already had this vision ahead of time. He already knew what was going to happen that night, or very soon to come. And I propose, you remember, this was where Daniel was offered the third ruler in the kingdom. It would have been behind Nabonidus and his son Belshazzar there. So Daniel was offered these lavish gifts and to be the third ruler, and Daniel just said, you can keep them. And this is one of the reasons why, because he already knew that the Medes and Persians would be taking the capital very soon, of Babylon there. And so whether he knew it would be that very night, I'm not sure, but he probably did. And he told Belshazzar, well, you can keep those gifts. I'm not interested in them. But Belshazzar gave them to him anyway. But he only got to keep that position as the third ruler in the kingdom for a few hours until the Medes and Persians came in, and Belshazzar was put to death that night. Now, it appears by the wording here that Daniel was not physically in Susa, but he was there in the spirit, in his vision that he was seeing. He said, I raised my eyes, in verse 3, and saw and behold a ram standing on the bank of the canal. It had 2 horns. Both horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher one came up last. I saw the ram charging westward and northward and southward. No beast could stand before him, and there was no one who could rescue from his power. He did as he pleased, and he became great. Now, we know that the 2 horns represent the kings of Media and Persia. And how do we know that? Because so much of the time in the book of Daniel, you just keep reading and it answers some of the questions. And so in verse 20, we see that the angel tells Daniel that that's what these 2 horns represent, are 2 kings, from the kings of Media and Persia. Wiersbe says we will meet 5 main characters in this chapter. And he lists Daniel, Cyrus, Alexander the Great, Antiochus IV, Epiphanes, and the Antichrist. Now, I propose that there should be maybe a 6th, and that would be Astyages. That was supposedly Cyrus's grandfather, who was the king of the Medes, and who Cyrus overthrew and incorporated into the Persian kingdom then. So There's some different opinions on that, but just about everything in Daniel has different opinions on it. Anything this far back in history, there's usually some questions about things, but Daniel especially, it seems there's so much history here that there is a lot of questions about, because it's so hard to find the accuracy there. And so much of the history was written hundreds of years later, after the fact of the things that happened. So I propose that this grandfather, if that's indeed who it was, we do know his name, Astyages, and he was the Median king. And some accounts say that Astyages was Cyrus's grandfather, as I said, and so I think he would have been the little horn, the one that came up first. But then Cyrus came and grew beyond him and ended up taking the kingdom and incorporating them together. It was only with the help of Media that Babylon was able to overthrow the Assyrian Empire when they came to power. Evidently, the Chaldeans fell out of favor with the Medes after the death of Nebuchadnezzar. Had some upheavals there, and some of the kings were, in some ways, worse than Nebuchadnezzar, maybe. And indeed were in Nebuchadnezzar's later years. He came to realize and recognize the Jehovah God. Now, after seeing his hold into, or securing his hold in eastern Iran, and before taking Babylon, Cyrus turned his attention to the nomadic Sakai, which would have been the part of the Scythians to the north. And he captured the king, Amorgus, if I've got all these names pronounced correctly. But a lot of people don't know a lot of this history. But Amorgus' wife, Sparithra, gathered an army of 300,000 men and 200,000 women and defeated Cyrus in battle. That was a army of 500,000 people. What Cyrus had in that battle, I don't know. Wasn't able to come to that, but they did say that eventually Cyrus commanded an army of 500,000 or 500,000 also. Now, Cyrus released after his defeat there by his wife, this guy's wife, and released him, and actually they became friends and became allies, and they attacked Lydia together. Alexander the Great would later defeat these same people, presumably somewhere in the area of Tashkent, up in Uzbekistan and in that area. Now, he may have died, talking about Cyrus, he may have died fighting the Massagetæ in the western area of modern-day Uzbekistan. And so we see that it mentions about Cyrus here. And I think it's in verse 2. I'm looking for. No, it's in verse 4. It says, no one could rescue from his power. He did as he pleased, and he became great, and certainly he did. For the years that Cyrus ruled, and he had the biggest empire that ever, up until that time, had ever, and until Rome came on the scene. Matter of fact, it had the biggest empire that had been ruled. Well, actually, Alexander's exceeded it, which once Alexander was going off scene, it began to decline quickly, though. But for long term, Persia was the largest empire that the world had ever seen. Now, so we see that as he defeated these other places, but then he made his own defeat. And that's one point I was going to make. That we see this phrase or similar phrases. No one could rescue from his power. He did as he pleased and became great. You look at like Nebuchadnezzar, and even though you may not read these words, and Alexander the Great later on, they were essentially the same. No one could stop them. And all of these, and this goes back to the sovereignty of God, all of these, as long as God's hand was on them, that doesn't mean they were righteous people, but as long as God's hand was on them, then they were unstoppable. It's only when God took his hand off and said, that's as far as you're going, that they met their end. And most of the time, the next person came along that said that no one could stop them. They did as they pleased. And so one after the other, we see that in history. We'll see that when the Antichrist comes on the scene. The last of these people mentioned in all of this that's left to come. We'll see that with him. He'll be unstoppable until Christ comes back himself and destroys him. You and I will not stop him. No one else will stop him. He will be unstoppable except for Jesus Christ, and come back and we'll make an end to it. Now, so we see that Cyrus is referred to as a servant, but it's also true of Nebuchadnezzar and of others who came to power after Cyrus. Nebuchadnezzar was called the servant of God. Of this we can be sure: if God raises someone up to fulfill a purpose and blessing, or to fulfill his judgments, as he did some of these, they will not be stopped. That is, until God takes his hand off them. At that time, no one can save them. Once God's hand's taken off, no one can save them. It's over. Now, a century before Cyrus appeared on the scene, the prophet Isaiah in Isaiah 41:2 called him righteous, and in 44:23, he is called God's shepherd. So, now a lot of people think that because it says Cyrus was righteous there in chapter 42, verse 2 of Isaiah, that he worshiped Jehovah God. I don't think that's the case. Now, it's always possible that later on he maybe did. We don't know. There's nothing in the scriptures that indicates that or otherwise. He let the children of Israel go back, the Israelites go back to Israel and rebuild the temple and rebuild the walls, and just as prophesied. But he also let others, all the people that Babylon had conquered and did the same thing they did to Israel, go back to their places and return to their ways of worship, whatever it was. And he also seemed to call on Marduk himself. So, in the end, God's the judge. But I think as far as the statement that he was righteous, I think that has to do with not his standing before God, but in his actions, because he was a what we'd call a benevolent dictator today. He was a benevolent king. He did things much different than what other conquerors had done before him, and which was to take the people captive out of their land and put them somewhere else, so that it'd be harder for them to organize to revolt. He actually put them back into the land and left them in the land, those that were already there, and tried to be reasonably kind to them. And so some think, like I say, he's a worshiper of Jehovah. If that's, I'm not going to say if that's what you believe, that's fine. But I think that the term righteous there has to do with his actions rather than his standing before God. Uh, at any rate, and kind of to back that up on the point I'm making is we see also in chapter 45 of Isaiah in verses 4 and 5, where it says, this is the English Standard Version, I name you, though you do not know me. And in verse 5 it says, I equip you, though you do not know me, talking about Cyrus. So I'm inclined to believe that he did not, he was a good king, but he was not a worshiper of Jehovah God unless that happened sometime later. Now, Daniel, and we'll go just a little bit here, but we'll wrap this portion up. In verse 5 it says, as I was considering, behold, a male goat came from the west across the face of the whole earth, without touching the ground, and the goat had a conspicuous horn between his eyes. Now, where it says is without touching the ground, again, just like the leopard with the four wings, this is a good description of Alexander the Great. With the feet without touching the ground, that has to do with speed, and it's an indication that this goat was fast. And as with the leopard, in the same way, both were very descriptive of Alexander and his tactics. He conquered the known world at the time, and I talked about how large the Persian Empire was. Well, Alexander was even greater, and so, but he had it conquered by the time he's 33 years old. And so it says he came to the ram with the two horns, which I had seen standing on the bank of the canal. He ran at him in his powerful wrath. I saw him come close to the ram, and he was enraged against him and struck the ram and broke the two horns. And the ram had no power to stand before him. And remember, we talked back in the verse, I think verse 4, that it says that no one could stop that first ram. Now, we'll see that here's the new one that came on the scene, and this is Alexander the Great. It says there was no one who could rescue Cyrus, which was not Cyrus at this time, because some time had passed, and the Persian Empire lasted a good long while, hundreds of years, and so we'll see that by the time Alexander came on the scene, then we're talking more about the empire itself than we are the person, the king. And there was no one who could rescue the ram from his power. Then the goat became exceedingly great, but when he was strong, the great horn was broken, and instead of it, there came up four conspicuous horns toward the four winds of heaven. And I'll just say right quick that the wrath, the anger that Alexander the Great had for Persia came due to a couple of times that Persia invaded Greece and actually took and destroyed cities. So many Greeks had died at the hands of the Persians. And so Alexander harbored a hatred for the Persians and the Medes, especially the Persians, from the time he was brought up as the son of a king there in Greece, a king of Macedon. And so, yes, and just as it talks about him coming, with his feet out, not touching the ground. If you ever get a chance, look up the Battle of Gaugamela. The Battle of Gaugamela. And you'll see what a tremendous feat Daniel pulled off when he came and defeated the Persians. 2 times that he met them and defeated them. And so, and the last time he took the whole kingdom on the second attempt there and continued his march to the rest of the empire at that time. And so I'm going to leave it there, and we'll come back and pick up here We may say a little bit more. We will talk more about Alexander. Tremendous general. Um, I've said before, I think that it's not his personal life, certainly, but I do have great respect for Alexander the Great's military prowess and his bravery. He was usually right in the midst of the battle, charging. He was one of the generals, like um, necessarily a lot of most other rulers and most other generals who would sit back and watch the forces from a distance. He was right there participating, and so he led one of the charges when he faced greatly outnumbered by the Persians. Uh, Alexander had a fairly small army he traveled with and took with him, but overcame great odds in most of the battles that he faced. And so we'll close here and we'll pick up back in verse 6, go back and maybe say a little more about it, but because of time, like I say, we don't want to cut short, but we'll make sure we cover it when we come back to the next session. Dale Little, Rescue American Ministries in Chesnadilla, Romania.